Hello, welcome to the Everyone's Business webinar on supporting employers to respond effectively to domestic abuse. This webinar will be approximately half an hour and is a pre-recorded webinar. Over the next half an hour, we will be looking at what domestic abuse is, how you as an employer can provide a supportive response to any employee that might be experiencing domestic abuse. We'll look at what some of the barriers are and have been for employees experiencing domestic abuse, particularly in light of the current pandemic. And then we have some questions that have been asked of us from employers and employees around what a supportive response might be and what people can do in the workplace. So my name's Alessia Bianco and I am the Everyone's Business Partnership Manager within Hestia. Hestia is an organisation that supports people who've experienced domestic abuse, and part of that is the Everyone's Business Initiative, which is a national sort of initiative that supports employers all across the country around their response to domestic abuse. Some of the ways that we do that are providing support with employers and organisations' policies and procedures. We provide different kind of levels of training, so from a domestic abuse awareness training to more specialist training for HR and line managers to a domestic abuse champions training, specifically for employees within an organisation that want to take that forward and have a kind of more 360 response and approach to domestic abuse in their workplace. And we also provide support and information and training for employees that might be experiencing domestic abuse and how, you know, what that response might be, and also people that might be choosing to be abusive and perpetrating domestic abuse. So I'm just going to share my screen for the first half so that we can go through the PowerPoint together. If anyone does want that, then the contact details will be towards the end. Just get in touch with us and we can take that forward. So we'll be looking at what some of the barriers might be, how you can offer a supportive response, and kind of Q&A after that. The first thing I would say is that, which is really important, is that domestic abuse can happen to absolutely anyone. It doesn't discriminate in terms of people's background, their age, gender, sexual orientation, ethnicity, whether or not they're in the workplace, how much money they have in the bank. It can happen to absolutely everyone, from someone who is the CEO of an organisation to someone who's never been in work in their adult life. So it's really important that we bear that in mind and we keep that to the forefront when we think about domestic abuse, because often domestic abuse comes with its own connotations and its own stereotypes, and some of those are actually quite unhelpful for us, particularly if we have an employee who is enduring domestic abuse but doesn't fit the mould or the stereotype we might be holding on to, i.e. domestic abuse only happens to those types of people or in those types of families, for example. That having been said, we do know that there is kind of more of a prevalence and disproportionality for some sectors of society that might experience domestic abuse. So, for example, we know that 1 in 4 women and 1 in 6 men will experience domestic abuse in their lifetime. So that equates to around 1.2 million women and around 700,000 men, something like that. So we can see that there is a disproportionality, and we often will talk about domestic abuse being a gender-based crime in those ways and for lots of other different nuances. However, it's really important that we don't forget, and we always talk about the 700,000 men a year who experience domestic abuse, and we talk about the almost 1 million children a year who experience domestic abuse. Similarly, sort of if someone has a disability, they're 3 times more likely to experience domestic abuse than non-disabled counterparts. 1 in 3 LGBT people will experience domestic abuse. 1 in 3 to 1 in 2 BME people will experience domestic abuse. So we can see that there are certain sectors of society where that is more prominent, and it's important and useful for you as an employer to consider and think about how do you reach those demographics. And we'll look at what some of the barriers are later, and from some of the kind of more recent studies that have been done from our partners in different domestic abuse organisations, particularly in relation to the pandemic and the current lockdowns. Domestic abuse can happen in intimate partner relationships. That's often the type of domestic abuse most people think about. So husband to wife, girlfriend to girlfriend, sort of those types of relationships. But it's not exclusively. So it can also be between family members. So an adult grandchild to their grandparent, niece to nephew, sort of brother to sister, etc. Currently, we don't have a legal definition of domestic abuse. We have a cross-government definition, which encompasses the fact that it can happen to anyone and that it is within intimate partner relationships and or family members, and that it can include current partners or ex-partners as well. So it might be where we start thinking about stalking and harassment, for example, but again, not exclusively. And that it includes so-called honour-based violence, female genital mutilation and forced marriage. Of course, understanding that there is no honour in so-called honour-based violence either. One of the things that I often do, in fact almost always do, is talk about domestic abuse as opposed to domestic violence. And the reason for that is when we think about domestic violence, I don't know about any of you, but for me, it often conjures up images of physical abuse. And a lot of that is to do with the way that domestic abuse is portrayed in the media and in kind of the sort of entertainment sphere of if a domestic abuse homicide, for example, is talked about in the media, there will often be the stock images of a man hovering above a woman, or a woman with kind of black eyes and bruising. And whilst physical violence and abuse is definitely a part of some people's experience of domestic abuse, it's not the totality. For a lot of people who experience domestic abuse, they will report that they have never experienced a physical act of violence, but they have lived in constant fear, or they have been belittled or felt kind of lots of other different types of abuse, which might fall under coercive control, for example, or economic and financial abuse. Economic and financial abuse is something that we see a lot in terms of how perpetrators will use economic abuse to potentially stop that person from gaining employment, for example, ruining their clothes so that they can't get to work. Currently, one of the things that often we'll see, are seeing because of the pandemic and the lockdowns, are perpetrators destroying company property. So, for example, destroying the person they're being abusive towards laptop or phone, which is a work laptop or phone, which means that then they're not able to do their duties at work. And over a period of time, the first time it might be sort of explainable as an accident, but the second, third, fourth time, for some employers, that frustration of you're not looking after your company property, and that there might then be a disciplinary procedure because of that. And we've definitely heard of cases where that has happened, and yet no physical violence or sexual abuse has taken place. So it's really important that when we have people that might be enduring domestic abuse, we think beyond the physical abuse that might or might not be happening for people, and that each person's experience of domestic abuse is going to be different. I have never worked with anyone whose experience of domestic abuse has been exactly identical to someone else's, and that will be because, you know, we're all different, we're all unique, we all have our own set of life experiences and skills. But so do perpetrators, and perpetrators will often know, people who choose to abuse, they will know what sort of things they can do that are going to be the most impactful, whether that's turning up to someone's place of work unannounced to make them feel on edge, whether that's prohibiting them from seeing their family or their friends, so using isolation to be abusive, or limiting kind of who that person can see, what they can wear. For some people, it might be actually you take a lot of pride in your appearance, so I'm going to economically and financially abuse you so that you can't afford to wear makeup, for example. I'm going to prohibit you from doing that, and that's going to make you feel a certain way, and all the things in between. So we're not going to go through kind of an exhaustive list of what domestic abuse is in this webinar today, but it's really that the key message is it can happen to anyone. Anyone can be a perpetrator, in terms of the fact that where you've got employees enduring domestic abuse, you're going to have people perpetrating, and perpetrators don't often have a sign saying I'm a perpetrator of domestic abuse. Often it's the people who they can come across as very charming, very personable, and we often talk about the early stages of an abusive relationship being very similar to the grooming stages that we see within child sexual exploitation. and that some perpetrators will be trying to groom and isolate and charm not just the person they're being abusive towards, but also that person's friends, family, support network, work colleagues. So what barriers might employees and employers face when thinking about domestic abuse? There's a really interesting sort of study that has been done by Women's Aid recently that talks about this. And also the Minister for Business, Paul Scully, has recently talked about some of the barriers that they feel that employers might face. And this is definitely something that is echoed in the research and the work and support that we have done and are doing at Everyone's Business. So some employers have said, actually, there's limited support available. So if I'm an employer, maybe I'm a HR manager and I have an employee who is saying, I need some support around domestic abuse, that it can be difficult for employers to know where to go. Around 5% of employers in this country have an actual policy around how they can support their staff enduring or choosing to be abusive. So it's no wonder really that with that limited amount of support, where is that person going to go? And often one of the things that we see with employers that don't have a domestic abuse support system in place is that they're scrabbling around between different pieces of legislation, some of which potentially isn't very fit for purpose anymore and has been written, you know, a long while ago, or they're looking at things that might not be appropriate. So for example, we have an advice line for employers, and sometimes we would get calls from employers saying, I'm not quite sure, this person saying they're experiencing domestic abuse, but the abuse they're saying they're experiencing seems so far-fetched that maybe we're concerned about their mental health. And actually, without having a good response and without having a policy in place, that can lead to a lot of damage in terms of not being able to support the person who is experiencing domestic abuse, and could potentially also increase their level of risk. We've heard that some people are saying, well, there is support available, but it's not up to date, or it's really hard to find. So I don't know any of you, if you've ever worked in an organisation or a company where you have policies and procedures, but you have loads. You know, some organisations, how useful is it to have 600 policies or even, you know, 100 policies if people don't read them or if people don't know about them? And the assumption sometimes that we make in organisations is, well, I know about it, therefore everyone's going to know about it. And that's not something that is necessarily true or that we see. We also have to think about the fact that a policy is fantastic, or any kind of documentation around how we can support people is fantastic, but is it something that reaches out to everyone within an organisation? So for example, if you work for an organisation where reading and writing and literature isn't very high because your organisation has different skill sets, is having a policy or a procedure that people aren't going to be able to access easily going to be appropriate? Or if you have work in an organisation where a percentage of your workforce, you know, is technology poor, so they're not necessarily able to access smartphones or laptops or things that, particularly from working from home, is something that some of us we would be taking for granted. How are they accessing the support available and the information available? Some people are saying that there is a lack of recognition and diversity amongst people who are experiencing domestic abuse. So, you know, it's all good and well that we're talking about what we can do as employers for our employees, but are we really taking into consideration the whole width and breadth of people's experiences? So thinking about, are we taking into consideration BAME, people's experiences of domestic abuse, LGBT? Are we making sure that the support that we offer is inclusive across all genders and not just specifically to women? There's nothing wrong with having key messages that are targeted to different people. So in some organisations, actually something I've seen more and more of is organisations having women's networks, for example, and talking in those women networks about the prevalence of domestic abuse as gendered crime. Wonderful. But then what's the equivalent? Do they have a men's network or an LGBT forum, for example, or other kind of key things that allow domestic abuse to be kind of shared across the board and the understanding and knowledge to be shared across that? Which brings me to the next point of ensuring that appropriate signposting is available to those specialist services. So, you know, there are national services like the National Domestic Abuse Helpline, for example, which is fantastic. But then looking at what about the kind of more specialist services that might be more approachable or applicable to other people, and really putting yourself in the position of that person, that for some people they will feel more comfortable calling a national service. For other people, they would feel much more comfortable calling the men's advice line, for example, if they're a man who's experiencing domestic abuse or they're worried about a male friend or colleague, as an example. So kind of really thinking about either doing your research or getting in touch with specialist domestic abuse organisations to help you find that comfortable place. This, I think, is really important. Something that we hear a lot of from people who are experiencing domestic abuse is that if someone is choosing to disclose that they are experiencing domestic abuse for whatever reason, for some people, there are multiple disclosures that go with that. So, for example, if I identify as LGBT, which I do, and I am experiencing domestic abuse, but I haven't told my employer that I identify as LGBT for whatever reason, I might need to get support from my employer. So first of all, I'm experiencing domestic abuse and the massive risk that employees will sometimes feel that they're taking and divulging that information, let alone if the person who's choosing to be abusive also works in the same organisation. It can get really tricky, or if that perpetrator, going back to that grooming stage, has been isolating the person who's experiencing domestic abuse and has been grooming kind of other people within the organisation. But now that person might potentially be feeling like I have to share or I have to disclose my sexual orientation, which they may not want to or may not feel safe to do. Or if that person has a disability and they say, for example, we had someone who had called the advice line to say that one of their employees was experiencing domestic abuse, and what their perpetrator was doing was taking away their walking aids so that they couldn't comfortably get to work. So they were getting to work, but always a little bit later because of that. But someone might not feel comfortable to say, I have a walking aid, or I need kind of additional support. And particularly if the culture within an organisation is not supportive, or if someone's a new employee, they might not have had that conversation yet. So it's really important that we remember it's not just someone disclosing they're experiencing domestic abuse, which is hard enough, but there might be additional factors there as well. Confidentiality is one of the questions we get asked most often. How confidential is me telling my employer? And of course, we can never kind of say, and we shouldn't be saying 100% that we will keep everyone's information confidential, because you don't know. There might be times that because of the level of risk, you need to, as a positive employer, contact the police, or you need to contact other services. But the thing that fundamentally people want to know is, am I going to be the office place gossip? Is everyone going to be talking about me behind my back? And of course, the answer to that should be no. And we feel really confident that that's not what employers kind of want or intend, but making it really clear, because otherwise, how are employees meant to know? And that is a barrier that is being reported for them to come forward. And one of the biggest ones, perhaps of all, is the fear of not being believed. So if someone is in an abusive relationship or being abused by someone in their family, often what perpetrators will do is say, you know, go and tell your employer, go and tell whoever you want. No one's going to believe you. And that goes back to the drip effect of psychological abuse, coercive control, making someone feel lesser than. And so really importantly, that if someone is choosing to come forward and talk about the fact that they're experiencing domestic abuse, or if you as an employer are noticing different signs and start to have those conversations, that fundamentally we have an ethos within the organisation of believing people, because the fear of not believing them is much greater. Brings us nicely to kind of what can you do as an employer. So at Everyone's Business, we think that it's kind of boils down to three things. One is to believe people, the second one is to offer a response of support, and the third one is to refer. So it's not about making anyone domestic abuse specialist, it's not about taking on more than we can handle, but it's just about kind of offering a good enough support service. So what we mean by believing them is not asking kind of inquisitive questions or saying like, oh, where's the evidence, or I've heard X, Y, and Z, but really looking at how can we support you as an employee within this organisation, and taking it from there, and being aware that where we might be might not be where they are. So someone might be disclosing I'm experiencing domestic abuse, and what they might want in that moment is to be heard and to be believed by you, not necessarily to go into action planning mode, because they may not know, and that we take it at that person's space and pace. So then having a response of some sort around domestic abuse, this is a question for all of you. What can you put in place within your company and organisation to support your employees? And I want you to think about that. And if the answer is I'm not sure, that's okay, but question that. So if you're not sure, is there, because maybe there isn't anything in place, or maybe there is, and you can go and find out what that is. But in most circumstances, there's always more that we can be doing as employers to ensure that our employees are supported, whether they're enduring domestic abuse, witnessing it, or perpetrating domestic abuse. And then referring to those specialist services that I've mentioned, making sure that we allow that person to be able to access those specialist services if they want. And again, being aware that you might say to someone, you know, I've heard this really great domestic abuse service, here's their contact details. But it's up to them whether they choose to get that support, and in what time frame. So it might be in 6 months' time that they then call that service, and because they might not have been ready at the time, but they will remember how you made them feel. So if you've made them feel supported and heard and listened, that's going to be much more impactful than sort of someone who isn't able to do that. I've mentioned that we have an advice line. So the Everyone's Business advice line is free, it's confidential, it's open Monday to Friday 9 to 5, and it's for any of you, any employer, any employee within the country who just perhaps might want some advice around domestic abuse. Often we might get people that are calling saying, I think my colleague is experiencing domestic abuse and I'm not quite sure. Or sometimes we get calls from HR or managers, I think I want to talk to my employee because I'm worried about them, and I just want to go through how I might start that conversation. And some employers and employees will call us once, some will call multiple times to kind of go through those different stages of support that they are providing their employee. You don't have to say which company you work for, it doesn't matter. From our perspective, some people do, some people don't. Obviously, if you email us, it's a bit harder because we can see the email address, but people can email or they can call the advice line phone number, and we will be here to offer that support at that person's pace. Okay, so for the question bit, I'm just going to stop sharing my screen, and I've got some questions here that have been asked. So I'm going to try my best to answer them. So the first question that has come in is, how has COVID and the pandemic impacted domestic abuse? I think that's a very, very good question. So there's multi-layers to this. So first thing that we've seen is, and I think a lot of domestic abuse services would probably speak to this as well, is that we've seen people who choose to be abusive and perpetrators try and use the pandemic for their own gain, so to justify their behaviour. So some of the ways that we've seen that is perpetrators refusing, particularly in the first lockdown back in March, refusing to take precautions to protect themselves and their families. Another one that we started to see and might kind of see an increase in as we go through this year is people refusing to take the vaccine, for example. Not necessarily because they have their own reasons for it, which is, you know, their stuff, but more as a way to continue to be controlling or prohibitive the person they're being abusive towards in taking the vaccine, if that's something that they would like to do. But on the converse of that, we've seen some perpetrators tightening down, creating stricter measures in the household. So not allowing the person they're being abusive to or the whole family from leaving the house, for example, and making them live on much more scarcer food supplies or money, or using the pandemic in any way. So, for example, we had a person who was being abusive who chose to use the pandemic as the reason as to why they were being abusive, in terms of, I'm always in the house, you're getting on my nerves, and undoubtedly COVID and everyone living together is harder for some people, but the pandemic and COVID is not the reason why people are being abusive. Those are the choices that people are making, and they're using that to justify their behaviour. We have seen, so back in March on the 23rd, when we were all told, you know, stay home, it's where you're all going to be safer by the government. If someone's experiencing domestic abuse, for many people that was not the safest place for them to be, and it just meant that they were spending more and more time locked in with the person or people that were choosing to be abusive towards them. And so the Office of National Statistics did release that from March to June there was a 7% increase in domestic abuse reporting and domestic abuse crimes in respective to the previous year, so 2019 now. And we know and we saw that sadly 10 women and 2 children were murdered as a result of domestic abuse in the first 2 weeks of the first lockdown. And that was an increase of 3 times the amount of domestic homicides that we would see at any one point. And that there has been a continued increase in domestic abuse and domestic abuse reporting across the board. And that, you know, that escalation potentially could be because there's less breathing space if someone is experiencing domestic abuse in the home. It could also be because there's not as many opportunities for that person to seek help and support, particularly at the moment. So we're all currently in another lockdown. It's February now. However, it's been made really, really clear by the government that if you are experiencing domestic abuse, the restrictions do not apply. So you can leave, you can go to a place of safety, you can continue to get the help and support that you need. That's another thing we've seen perpetrators do, is deny that person the ability to go and do that. And so one of the things that was put in place around May was the Safe Spaces scheme that some of you might have heard of. And safe spaces, so currently in some pharmacies, Morrison's pharmacies, Superdrug pharmacies and Boots, you can go to any of those places and ask to use their consultation room. And if the consultation room is available, you'll be taken in by a member of staff, and there is either a computer or a phone, or sometimes both, and a whole host of resources around domestic abuse. And for some people, that can be really life-saving. It has been really life-saving in order to be able to get the support that they need, but saying to the person who's being abusive towards them, I'm just going to nip to Boots, or I'm just going to go to the pharmacy for a logical kind of reason, and then being able to get that support. So we are seeing kind of the ways that the pandemic and COVID has impacted people experiencing domestic abuse, and for children as well. So some children now, currently again, a lot of children are not in school, but if you're a child of a key worker or you have additional needs, for example, that some children are able to go to school, but for those that are not, or where the perpetrator is refusing to allow that to happen, that safe space that a child could go to either at school or nursery is restricted as well. There was a survey that was done by Women's Aid earlier, just before the end of last year, and what they found was that 52% of people who were experiencing domestic abuse felt more afraid during the pandemic than they did before. And sadly, 58% of people said that during the first lockdown, so from March to June, they felt they had no one to turn to. Now, we know that around 40% of people who experience domestic abuse are in the workplace. So of that 58%, a high proportion of people will have been at work. Some of them will have been working from home, some of them will have had to adapt, but it's really distressing to hear that a majority felt they had no one to turn to. And the question is that because employers didn't know what support was available? Did employees not know where they could go? And are we doing enough as businesses and organisations to make sure that those messages are kind of heard loud and clear? Okay. Second question, how can organisations start to build a response to domestic abuse? So some of it I've mentioned. I think a really good start is to have a statement or a policy or a guidance document, or all three, around we're an employer and this is how we support our staff experiencing domestic abuse. And also this is how we support people who might be choosing to be abusive, because you will have or could have a cohort of people that are choosing to be abusive but want to get support around that. And whilst we can have policies that say we do not condone this behaviour, you know, are there things that we can put in place to be supportive as well? Other things that we can do is ensure our culture is a supportive culture, not just around domestic abuse, but around all sorts of different issues, because people who are experiencing domestic abuse will pick up on that. So if you have a culture of office-placed banter, for example, that isn't conducive and isn't supportive, how likely is it that that person, if they are experiencing domestic abuse, is going to go to you as an employer? Perhaps a lot less likely. And be really clear what your key messages and communication strategy is. So one of the things we see is when we work with employers is that having a supportive response to domestic abuse is not a quick fix. It's not something that, to do well, can be done in a few weeks or a month. So often what's useful is to have a implementation strategy anywhere between 12 to 24 months or a year and a half, and thinking about what are the key messages you want to have and what are the key dates or key points in the year that you can push those messages. So it could be looking at key dates internally for you as an organisation. Could also be looking at International Women's Days, the 8th of March, International Men's Days, the 14th of November, the end of elimination of violence against women and girls and domestic abuse is from the 25th of November to the 10th of December, for example. LGBT month, all those different kind of times that might be really useful, and having a strategy and a plan. Who can use the employer's advice line and what other services are there? So I think I've said the advice line, anyone can contact via phone or email to the advice line, Monday to Friday, 9 to 5. What other services are there? So safe spaces. We've just launched recently online safe spaces as well in partnership with some organisations, so Parcel Force and the Royal Mail, for example, but not exclusively. And the more kind of companies and organisations take that on, the better. And online safe spaces is so, for example, if you go onto the Parcel Force website, the bottom of their website you will see a UK Says No More widget, which is like a blue badge. If you click on that, it will come up with a different pop-up window, and there is information around domestic abuse, how to get support, and what support services you can access across the country. And that can be very useful as well. It doesn't store the information. So if someone who is abusive was to look at what have you been looking at, if you went on the Parcel Force, it would just come up with the Parcel Force website or Google, and that's much easier to explain. We also have Bright Sky, which is a mobile phone app which can be downloaded for free on Android or Apple. And the mobile phone app is a weather app. When you press it for a few seconds, it changes, and it's a domestic abuse support app. So it can be useful for supporting if you're experiencing domestic abuse, or supporting friends, family, colleagues. And it also has a location service setting and has a journal setting. So you can take videos, pictures, voice recordings. You need a safe email address to send it to, and we have seen some prosecutions via the CPS based on some of the evidence from the Bright Sky app as well. What's one thing you would recommend employers do is the next question. Well, if I had one thing, have a policy. The most important thing, in my opinion, is to have a policy, because if you're someone who's experiencing domestic abuse and you're in an organisation, logically, for a lot of people, they will look to see, what is my company doing to support people, or what can they do to support people experiencing domestic abuse? And if they type domestic abuse into the intranet, or look at kind of where the policies are, and they don't find anything, that's going to be really disheartening. And logically people think, okay, there isn't something there. And I've worked with a lot of organisations that have said, oh, we do support our employees, we just don't have it in writing. But how are employees meant to know that? So it's great that we know that, but if our employees and our members of staff don't know, then it becomes a lot trickier. In the same way that if someone is pregnant, one of the first things they'll do is look at, what's my maternity leave policy? Or if someone's facing redundancy, they'll look at, what's the redundancy policy? It follows a similar vein. So really important that we have policies and procedures, but that they are accessible, that they speak not just to people in HR or comms who kind of regularly will read these, but they speak across the organisation, and that they're not hidden somewhere that then they're never looked at again until they're ready for review. How do we raise awareness of domestic abuse in organisations in a safe way at work? Really good question. in a nutshell, if you're going to send out communication about domestic abuse, so you're an employer, you're starting to think about your 12-month strategy, for example, that you send it to the whole organisation, because if you send it just to some key people, but they are experiencing domestic abuse, it's a lot harder to explain. If a perpetrator is reading their emails, for example, it's something we're seeing more of an increase in with people working from home. Bright Sky that I've mentioned is fantastic, but having it as something that is downloaded automatically on people's work phones is much easier and much safer than asking people to download it on their personal devices. Also kind of making sure that you as an employer are up to date with the newest things that are happening in domestic abuse, and one of the ways to do that is by joining the Employers Initiative on Domestic Abuse, or IDA. They're a free organisation who can support employers and businesses. They currently have over 470 different employers across the country, and they hold different network events around domestic abuse as well, which is very helpful. And the last question that I've been asked is, what are you hopeful for? One of the things that I'm very hopeful for and I'm very excited about is the domestic abuse bill, which I'm sure some of you will have heard of. So the domestic abuse bill is going through kind of subsequent readings at the moment. One of the things that the domestic abuse bill will do is provide a statutory definition of domestic abuse for the first time. So it's going to put domestic abuse on a legal footing. It's going to have economic abuse as a statutory definition for the first time. It's also going to talk about children's experiences of domestic abuse as being experiences in their own right, rather than sometimes we talk about children witnessing domestic abuse as though they're bystanders, and lots of other really fantastic things. The Employers Initiative on Domestic Abuse, that makes me hopeful as well. Their network events, the next one's on the 18th of March, and if anyone doesn't know about IDA or has heard of them, then EIDA, check them out. They're really fantastic. And probably the thing most recently that has made me feel really optimistic, particularly in terms of employers' responses to domestic abuse, is the open letter that was written by Paul Scully, who's the Minister for Business. And he wrote this letter asking unequivocally for all employers to support their employees around domestic abuse. And they've set up a working group, or they will be setting up a working group, particularly to look at employers' responses. And they published a review into the workplace support for victims of domestic abuse. That's what the paper was called. And some of the recommendations on it are just fantastic and really make me hopeful to think that we can continue to work with employers and employees across the board to look at a good response for domestic abuse. Because if you are experiencing domestic abuse, your place of work might be the only place of safety that you have. And, you know, what a fabulous way to ensure that people are able to get the support that they need at the time that they need it. And also a fantastic thing to ensure that employers feel confident in providing that support and comfortable in doing the pieces that they can in terms of believing people, responding to their needs and referring and signposting on, and holding back on the things that they can't, and that all of that will be encapsulated in policies and procedures. So those are all the questions that I had. If anyone has any other questions, then do feel free to email us or send us or give us a call. You can email us on everyone'sbusiness@hestia.org.uk, or you can contact the advice line, which is everyone'sbusiness@adviceline.org.uk. No, it's not. Adviceline.eb, sorry, adviceline.eb@hestia.org, or you can call us on 0203 879 3695. Other than that, I hope you are all well, and we look forward to seeing you soon.